and I just am always on Airbnb or always looking up flights, and I found a ridiculous deal to Dublin, Ireland, round-trip flights, $350. I can't even fly to Houston for $350 anymore these days. But it was interesting because then I started researching Irish history. And as I looked at Irish history, a major part of their culture and history is the centuries-long conflict that they had with Great Britain. And one of these conflicts arose one day when an Irishman and an Englishman walked into a bakery. And the Englishman walked straight up to the counter with no shame and just stole 3 tarts from the bakery, stuffed them in his pockets. As he's making his escape, he runs into the Irishman and he brags. He says, "That took great skill and guile to steal those 3 tarts. The owner didn't even notice." The Irishman shoots back, "That's just simple thievery. I'll do it the honest way and get the exact same results." So the Irishman then walks up to the counter of the bakery, calls the baker over, and says, "Sir, I'd like to show you a magic trick." He's intrigued and says, "Yeah, go ahead." So he said, "Sir, can I have 1 tart?" Baker gives him a tart, eats the tart. "Sir, can I have a 2nd tart?" Baker gives him a 2nd tart, scarfs it down. "Sir, I know this is asking for much. Can I have a 3rd tart?" Well, he obliges, he eats the tart, and now the baker's getting upset. He's saying, "Okay, my friend, where is this magic trick that you promised me?" And the Irishman leans over the counter and says, "Look in the Englishman's pockets." We are accustomed to conflicts between nations, aren't we? Whether it's Ireland versus England. You've seen a lot in the news these days with Ukraine and Russia. Apparently now it's the US versus Canada, I guess, but is it not? On again, off again, who knows? We're used to conflicts and rivalries between sports teams. It's March Madness season after all, isn't it? But there's something heartbreaking about feuds between family members. Absolutely heartbreaking. And I read the true story this week of an attorney who was working with 2 brothers, Jeb and Jerry. Jeb and Jerry were very close-knit, tight family like you would expect, and they were caretakers like many of you for aging parents. And when their father finally did pass, he had a $1 million estate in a time when this meant more like $5 million. And so the brothers agreed we would split this inheritance evenly. This money is not going to ruin our affection as brothers. And so the time came when their father passed, and they're sorting through his belongings, they're organizing and maybe discarding some outdated electronics, and they're leafing through all of these outdated magazines and just thousands of family photos and albums, until one day, as they were sorting that all up, they stumbled across an old inkwell. Ugly thing, not expensive, kind of cheap knick-knack that you find on the back shelf of like a dingy antique store. Nothing special. But Jerry, the youngest brother, stopped leafing through the magazines, and he said, "Hey, this old inkwell Dad gave to me in high school after I got accepted into Princeton." Well, that made Jeb shoot up and say, No, you have it all wrong. Dad gave me that old inkwell after I spent my time in military service. After all, Dad's dad gave it to him after the invasion of Normandy, so it belongs to me." Well, you can see how tense this is getting, right? And they're just going back and forth. "No, Dad promised this to me." "No, Dad disapproved of your military service in Vietnam," and just back and forth and back and forth. And these brothers are fighting over this inkwell. The attorney steps in, and he says, "Hey, let's set this aside for now. There's tons of other things to divide. Let's focus on those and come back to this later." But the damage was already done, folks. 1 week later, Jeb's lawyer threatened to take Jerry to court over this inkwell. This attorney who was writing the story, called back and said, "Hey, are you really going to split this family over an ugly piece of junk?" And Jeb's attorney responded, "It's not about the money. It goes much deeper than that." It certainly did. The brothers refused to speak to each other over the next decade. When Jerry was diagnosed and succumbed to terminal cancer and died, Jeb didn't even show up to the funeral. No, it's not about the money. It goes much deeper than that. And that's what we're going into here in Luke 12, folks. Jesus is caught in the middle of a family feud, and he uses this conflict to teach that when we battle over possessions, it often runs deeper than the object itself. Jesus' point is exactly the same as that lawyer's. No, it's not about the money, it's about your heart. So can I set the stage, some literary context before we get into Luke chapter 12? This chapter starts with a large crowd. They're gathering to hear Jesus, and the NASB says there are literally so many people gathering that they're stepping on each other. This crowd is building. The pressure's growing. They want to hear Jesus. And so in this moment, as the crowd is pressing in, Jesus turns his attention to his disciples. And he starts teaching them about some pretty heavy topics. I mean, we're talking topics like hypocrisy. Do you see that there in your Bible? Hypocrisy, God's care, the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. These are deep theological topics. And as he's teaching, verse 13, would you read it with me? And one of the crowd said unto him, Teacher, speak to my brother that he, what? Divide the inheritance with me. Imagine if, as I was preaching this morning, Morgan McCarty shot up in the balcony and yelled, Hey, Jeriel, our dad is dead. We know Rod was loaded, right, as Deacon Chairman. We know Rod is super loaded, but Ryan isn't sharing the inheritance with me. Jeriel, would you tell Ryan to split it fairly with me? Well, that'd be a bit of an interruption. This is a gathered worship service. This is a teaching time. And from a Western perspective, it's easy for us to miss what's going on in this passage. See, the Jewish system is so foreign to us. But Deuteronomy 21:17, the law says that the oldest son is guaranteed a double portion. So Deuteronomy 21:17 says, He shall acknowledge the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all he has. And so if you're the older sibling, you get 2/3. And if you're the secondborn, you get 1/3. Does that seem very fair? We feel for Morgan, right? That's not fair at all. But Jesus doesn't get lured into this trap. He doesn't hear this man's concerns and say, well, what is fair? No, he actually takes this outburst and turns it into an opportunity. And he sees right through this man's demand and into his heart. Because at the end of the day, Jesus calls this man out to his face. Look at verse 14. Man, who made me a judge or a divider, an arbiter over you? The irony is that Jesus, as God in the flesh, actually is a judge over this man. But not a judge to settle financial problems. Jesus didn't come to solve your financial problems. He came to settle our ultimate problem, our sin problem. He comes not to offer you health and wealth. He comes to offer you salvation, forgiveness of sins, a right relationship with God. And that's the irony here. Yes, God is a judge, but he came for something so much better than giving you money. It's not why Jesus came. And if I was that man, I would be so embarrassed because Jesus sees right through him, and maybe like many of us, we see Jesus as a means to an end. No, Jesus, I don't want you. I want the comfortable life you can give me. I want the self-advancement you can give me, Jesus. Give me that. And Jesus refuses to reward that type of behavior. He calls the man out to his face publicly, and then he does something that I would be mortified over. He uses that man as an object lesson to the crowd to tell them how they're not supposed to live. Look what I'm talking about. Verse 15, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consists not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. Jesus identifies the root of the man's demand, a problem that we still face over 2,000 years later, and that is we are tempted to place our trust in possessions, in things, in stuff, not in God, where it's supposed to be, but in things that are passing away. And today I'd like to show you 2 signs of a misplaced faith. You say, how do I know that my trust is in my possessions and not in God? I would argue from this text that Jesus gives you 2 signs of misplaced faith. The first being, you have a greedy spirit. A greedy spirit. In our culture, we're tempted to equate quality with quantity. Oh, my quality of life is determined based on how many things I possess. And so we even subtly do this with like, hey, you have how much in your Roth IRA? You must be very happy. You have how many bedrooms and bathrooms in your house? You must be so satisfied. Whoa, you took how many vacations last year? You must be stress-free. But the funny thing about that is that money doesn't guarantee happiness, does it? If that were the case, and the celebrities and the richest people in the world at the Oscars would be some of the happiest people on earth, and yet they're empty inside. They're not happy. They're living proof that a man's life consists not in the abundance of his possessions. But if you're tempted to believe the lie, you begin to equate stuff with satisfaction, then of course you'll be coveting. Of course you'll be greedy. But Jesus is saying if your primary focus is hoarding your resources and accumulating more power and prestige and amassing a greater fortune for yourself with no thought of God, there's the key, with no thought of God, then you've wasted your life. Wasted. Gone. And to prove this, he doesn't just say it like I said it. He actually tells a story, which is why I love Jesus. He is the storytelling preacher here in Luke. And in Luke 12, starting in verse 16, here's where the story starts. The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? Because I have no room to store my crops. And he said, this will I do. I'll pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I store all my crops and my goods. Did you notice that this man is already rich? This harvest isn't what makes him rich. He's already rich, and then on top of that, he has a really, really good year. And he runs into a problem. I have so much of a harvest that I don't have enough storage. Does that ever happen in America today? You have so much of a harvest that you don't have enough storage. And so what does he do? He tears it all down and builds up new barns. I have personally never faced this problem. I've never gone to Carmel and said, oh my goodness, I have so much money in our bank account that the FDIC only insures up to $250,000. We need to open up a new one. Maybe you have those types of first world problems. I do not. But I need to pause and clarify something. Is this rich man called a fool because he owned possessions? No. Is there anything wrong with being wealthy? No. Is there anything sinful about owning nice things? No. Is the problem that this rich man was entrepreneurial? Not at all. Jesus isn't condemning this man for those reasons. See, the rich man's problem wasn't that he owned his stuff, but that his stuff owned him. All throughout the Bible, Jesus talks about money. I mean, he talks about money a lot if you look at the Gospels, but Jesus and God are the giver of good gifts. The parable of the talent shows that what God gives us with our opportunities and resources, we're to use for his glory. We're supposed to take advantage of those opportunities for the sake of the kingdom. The Bible speaks favorably of wealthy individuals. Lydia, small business owner. The Proverbs 31 woman, an entrepreneur. You had the early church meeting in homes of oftentimes wealthy, rich women. So is the problem money in and of itself? No, but it is when your stuff starts to own you. And when your stuff starts to own you, there's a sign. It gets to your head. The rich man's problem was the folly of greed in that he had an improper focus. His problem is his pride, folks. He's obsessed with himself. Do you see that in the text? Did you notice those pronouns? You're thinking, Jerry, oh, come on, man. I thought I was in church, not English class. What are you talking about pronouns? I promise this is fascinating. Look at verse 17. Count all these personal pronouns. Ready? What shall I do? Because I have no room to store my crops. This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater. And there will I store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you see this? Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease. Eat, drink, be merry. In just those 3 verses, how often did you see I, me, mine, myself? It's all about who? Me. It's all about myself. You can't miss it. The rich man's selfishness is on full display for the world to see. And as this man's net worth increased, his standard of living grew, but his standard of giving did not. And that's a problem. Because there's absolutely no concern for God. There's no concern for others. He just wants to make his life as comfortable as possible. And the irony is that this man is only in this privileged position because of God himself. If you look at verse 16, it's the ground of a certain rich man who brought forth plentifully. Sure, the rich man put in a lot of sweat equity. Sure, he planted the seed. He watered the seed. But who gives the increase, guys? God. This man is in his position due to no effort of his own. It's God who blessed him in this way. But he doesn't honor him. He doesn't even acknowledge him. So because he doesn't acknowledge God, God does not acknowledge him. He sees this man living a self-centered, hedonistic, materialistic lifestyle. And what does God call him? A fool. He's not mincing words. God calls this type of thinking and living foolish. Look at verse 20. God said unto him, you fool, This night your soul shall be required of you. Then who shall those things be which you have prepared? So is he that lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Why does God call this rich man a fool? Number one, because he has an improper focus. He's thinking about himself when he should be thinking of God. And number two, he's investing in an inheritance that is fading away. You're a fool because you don't even realize you can't take it with you. And anything you accumulate in this life, that's it. Because there's this looming reality. God is going to require your soul. Friends, you will die. Every single one of us in this room has an expiration date. And I am a young man. There are many of you in this room who are very quick to remind me that, Jeriel, you are a young man. I have energy. I can eat what I want and I don't gain weight. It's awesome. I stand before you this morning proving it. I'm standing before you this morning in the wedding suit that I wore nearly 5 years ago. My in-laws are here in town for Mariah Shower, so I wanted to put that picture up. I stand before you still fitting in my suit, which is why I was mortified, no exaggeration, mortified when I saw, as I was combing my jet black hair this week, a silver strand. And I really could not believe it. And you laugh, but I named it Josh. I could not believe that I had already, at my age, a silver strand. And you laugh, but the topic of death can be a bald spot or a sore spot because we dye our hair and cover up our wrinkles and hit the gym because we don't want to grapple with this uncomfortable reality that we are getting older, that death is approaching a lot faster for some of us than we might even want to think. The issue is, like this man, we often don't think about death until it's too late. In college, I got to be in Titanic the musical. It was awesome. I got to wear pants up to my neck and a scratchy green suit, and I can see you're wondering, what role did you play? I was one of the band members on the Titanic, which is ironic because they gave the smallest, weakest guy the bulkiest instrument. I didn't understand it then. I still don't understand it now. But I remember in one scene, I had to exit stage right with my bass. And then my next cue was on stage left. The tricky thing was that you see those double basses that Kellis and Mitch play. These are big instruments. And I had to squeeze through an opening that was about that wide. And so the bass doesn't fit. I had to straddle it in between my legs and carry it like this and awkwardly waddle all of the entirety of backstage. But regardless of that, it was an incredible experience. And we remember the excitement of acting, and we're thinking, we're excited to board the Titanic, and we're super excited to start a new life in America. And you just have all of this raw emotion because you have this powerful live orchestra, a large chorus belting out show tunes. But at the end of the day, as actors, we know how the story is going to end, don't we? You have all this excitement, you're living your life on the ship, we're partying it up, but Titanic will collide with that iceberg. You know that ship is going in the water, and you know that thousands are about to meet their God. The issue is men and women on that Titanic did not know that eternity was just minutes away. And we've seen a lot in the media recently about plane crashes. Have you seen some of those videos? It's incredible to see what people are doing. If they're not cursing, what are they doing? They're praying. People who are not religious in the slightest, never are ever in a church, never go to church regularly, all of a sudden when confronted with the reality of death, they're thinking about their eternal soul. They're not thinking about, wow, I should have put in more overtime in the office. Wow, I wish I had just a little bit more money. No, in that moment when Titanic is plunging into the icy waters, it really doesn't matter if you're first or third class because at the end of the day, you are going down with the ship. Eternity is calling your name. And I remember just this raw emotion as we're doing the lifeboat scene and blocking it for the first time, people weeping, thinking about their eternal soul. Ecclesiastes says that there is wisdom in preparing for your own death before it's too late. And would you hold your place here in Luke 12 and go to Ecclesiastes with me? Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Hold your place here. This was the text that I preached at my grandmother's funeral a couple years ago. And they had the privilege of opening up her personal Bible and seeing her highlight these verses. There's nothing like it. Just thinking of the truths that comforted her own soul. Ecclesiastes 7 is what I preach, and I'm going to start in verse 2. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Can I put it in a way that you and I understand? It's better to spend your time at funerals than at parties. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, tells us if you want to be wise, you'll do this thing. You will embrace death. And that makes us uncomfortable. All of us, as soon as you say the D word, it's uncomfortable. Because that's way too depressing to be in the Bible. That's way too morbid. There's no way that God expects me to embrace death. But God says through Solomon, you are wise to embrace the reality that you will die one day. Why? Finish the rest of verse 2. For death, is the end of all men. And the living, guess what? That's you and me, unless you've nodded off in the service already. The living will take this to heart. Moses even writes this. Psalm 90:12 says, teach us to what? Number our days that we may acquire a heart of wisdom. Death has a way of making us stop and think. And I know even at Morningside, we have had a number of funerals this year already where beloved church members are either in this room or the chapel, and we see their coffin. And it's a startling reminder that every day that passes, one day is coming when we won't just be around the coffin, we'll be in the coffin. Are you prepared for that? Or like the rich fool, are you just saying, I am going to eat and drink and be merry? Friends, when I pause to consider that there's coming a day when Jeriel Ontoy will no longer stand in this pulpit or play this piano or think or breathe or work or play, it makes me stop and ask some really important questions. Questions like, is there an afterlife? What is my purpose? What am I even working for? Why am I here? And you know what? Those are good questions to ask while you still have breath in your lungs. Those are the questions that will determine whether you're a wise person or a fool. And sadly, the vast majority of people today are not prepared to embrace death. Most people in our culture ignore death. Like you ignore a salesman at the kiosk at the mall. You know he's there, but if I just keep my eyes forward and moving, eventually I will get out of this uncomfortable situation. But guess what? You can't do that with death. It's not avoidable. And so what do you see people do? They just mindlessly scroll on social media, or they bury themselves in hours of work so that they don't have to grapple with the things of God, when all the while that is what they should have been doing. And one day I'll get serious about God, but for now I am going to live my life like a practical atheist with no regard for God. In the meantime, I'll numb my pain. I'll squash down those feelings of insecurity and the deepest longings of my heart by indulging. And do you see how we are living out the motto of this rich man? Eat all you want, drink all you want, have all the immoral relationships you want, play all the video games you want, do whatever you want, because this life is all there is. And in this room, you might not ever say that, but look at the way you live. Do you live, in effect, as a practical atheist? This is foolish. Life is short. Hakuna Matata is not a slogan I want to go around living my life. And friend, if you're pursuing this lifestyle, it will never bring you lasting joy, lasting fulfillment, lasting peace. It doesn't matter how much you accumulate or how passionately you pursue those things, you will still be empty inside. And when God requires your soul, it will be too late. Do you see then why it's foolish to be greedy? Do you see why it's insane, literally insane, to pursue wealth as an end of itself? If you live this way, rich towards yourself with no thought of God, God calls you a fool. And do you know what's striking to me? Is that Jesus ends the story there. That is what the crowd hears. It's grim. It is not a happy ending. It's very sobering. But what does Jesus do then? He turns his attention from the parable in verses 12 to 21, which warns us of greed, and turns his attention to another group of people, to his disciples in verses 23 through 34. And he warns us of a different but related sin. How do I know my faith is misplaced? It's because I worry. I have an anxious spirit. Look at Jesus' words very quickly. Verse 22, take no thought. Verse 25, taking thought. 26, anxious. 29, anxious. Verse 32, fear not. This is the theme. Jesus has made a very clear transition from greed to anxiety. How are those two things related? Well, greed and worry are two sides of the same coin. And where greed can never get enough, worry is afraid it may never have enough. Do you see that relationship? And typically we manifest it in one of two ways, but the root cause is the same. We don't trust God. We trust our stuff. And actually, Pastor Joe preached a sermon on this recently, and he made an excellent point that I'm going to rip from his sermon entirely. So I'm giving him credit now. You don't need to have money to struggle with the love of money. I'm thankful to Pastor Jeff for reading the passage that he did in our reading this morning. It's not money that's the root of all evil. It's what? The love of money. You do not have to have money to love money. You can owe student loans and still love money. You can be a renter and still love money. It doesn't matter what tax bracket you're in. All of us are prone to this. The problem is, for most of us in this room, it paralyzes us with fear. We're so nervous about finding that right job right out of undergrad, or what am I going to do? I need to put food on the table, and it's a totally valid concern. Jesus is going to address it later. But when it paralyzes us, when it grips us, when it's all that we can think about, something has gotten miscalculated. You know why? Because Jesus gives you 3 reasons why you shouldn't worry, and we're going to wrap up with these this morning. The first is that life is about more than stuff. Look at verse 22. Take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, neither for the body what you shall put on. Why? The life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. That sounds a lot like verse 15, doesn't it? Life is about more than my possessions. But Jesus hones in into 2 specific things. Did you catch it? Food and clothing. And today we have food available 24/7. Just drive a few minutes down the road from your house and you can have food from literally all over the world available to you in an instant. In the ancient world, they didn't have that luxury. There's no DoorDash or Uber Eats or Grubhub. There's no grocery store, no modern supply chain, no refrigeration. When people prayed, give us this day our daily bread, they really meant that. You didn't know where your meal was coming from. It was totally different than today. The same was true for clothing. Unlike today, many people who were hearing Jesus teaching in this moment only had the clothes on their backs. I think of one of the most egregious examples of government corruption, and specifically in the area when it comes to clothing, and it's actually the Philippines, Filipino politics. In the 1970s and 80s, you might have heard of President Ferdinand Marcos. He exceeded his 2-term limit, enacted martial law. The country all of a sudden enters into a financial crisis, and instead of caring for the people, President Marcos was skimming off the top, taking money for himself to build mansions and treat himself to the finest foods that he could buy. But while many people know about President Marcos, they don't know a lot about his wife, Imelda Marcos. She was the first lady. Some of you have heard of the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Imelda was dubbed the Iron Butterfly. It's an interesting title. And this picture shows just, how fine of a life she lived. Nice hair, elegant gowns. And it turns out that Imelda Marcos was using the people's money to amass one of the most valuable collections of clothing in the world. Whenever they were ousted from office by Filipino rebels, they found 15 mink coats, 400 pieces of jewelry, 508 gowns, 888 handbags, and 1,060 pairs of shoes. How can you have enough days in your life to wear that amount of clothing? I can't imagine. I'm literally wearing the same stuff I had 10 years ago. It's just crazy. The ancient Israeli couldn't even believe this type of extravagance, this elegance. As you read this morning through that reading, if you have what? Food and clothing, let us therewith be content. How is it possible? Seriously, answer this question. How is it possible that we as a culture have more than any other culture in human civilization, and we still struggle the most in human civilization with depression, suicidal ideation, lust? See, we're not satisfied. We're anxious. We're greedy, we're lustful people because we have made this stuff our God. And this God can never satisfy your soul. It wasn't created to do that. Second reason you shouldn't worry is not only because life is about more than stuff, but your loving God is in control. And Jesus points out God's center of care in the next 2 verses. He uses 2 illustrations from nature. And if you notice, these 2 pictures address the 2 needs we just covered, food and clothing. First are the ravens in verse 24. Do you see that? They're unclean birds, ceremonially unclean under the Jewish law, and yet God provides for their food. They're not like the rich farmer. They don't have barns. They don't go farming, but God still feeds them every single day. Second are the lilies. They don't work. They don't spin. That means they don't make their own clothing. But every day they are arrayed in beauty. How does that happen? Because a sovereign, loving God cares for them. Not even look at the text. Not even Solomon, the richest man to ever live, the wisest man to ever live, was arrayed in beauty like the simple lily. And here's an incredible point that Jesus makes. If God so clothe the grass of the field, if God so feed even the unclean bird, how much more worried, anxious Christian will he care for you? You realize that your God cares for you, not you as a body. He cares for your soul. He loves you. He sees your anxiety. He knows what your needs are. He's in control. He cares of even the smallest detail, the silver strands of hair on your head. He knows. He cares. He sees. And so if I really believe that my God is all-powerful, that he's in complete control, my worrying doesn't solve anything, does it? That's what the next verse says. How much more does my God care for you? Don't believe the lie. Your loving God is in control. Third and finally, why should I not worry? If you're a believer, it's because you're not of this world. Look at verse 30. For all these things, all of these material things, do the nations of the world seek after. It's what the pagans seek after, but the Gentiles, the unsaved and unbelieving. And your Father knows that you have need of those things. And so what is the solution to a greedy spirit, to an anxious spirit? How do you guard against that? You seek God's kingdom first. Verse 31. But rather, instead of seeking those things, seek ye the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Wait a minute, Jerry, you mean there's something better than growing my money? Yes, giving it generously to those in need. Verse 33, sell what you have and give alms. If I can't take my treasures with me, then I'd be stupid to not invest it in others. I'll give to missions. I'll help those in financial need. I'll give to the benevolence fund. I will be generous with my money because I know I can take that with me. Because at the end of the day, I'm just a steward. You know that, right? It's not my money. It's God's for me to use as he pleases. Jeriel, you mean that any profits I make in this life are subject to inflation, to tariffs, to decay? Yes, but if you invest in God's kingdom, it's an eternal kingdom. Moths can never get to it. Rust will never corrupt it. Thieves, politicians, will never be able to steal from you. It's a treasure in the heavens that fails not, where no thief approaches, neither moth corrupts. And as we close, I want to ask you a very pointed question, and I hope it doesn't step on your toes, because it's not me. It's been convicting to me as I studied it this week. Have you gotten so occupied with building your kingdom that you have forgotten that you are a citizen of God's kingdom? Are you so caught up in the rat race of making more money and getting the next promotion and buying the bigger house and getting the bigger boat that you've forgotten you're not running the rat race, you're running a heavenly race? If you're a believer in Jesus, you are called to seek God's kingdom first. Is that clear enough? Seek God's kingdom first. And so guess what? When you shift your perspective, you don't have to fear, because lastly, verse 32, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. You get the best of both worlds. And some of you are sitting here today believing that God delights in withholding good things from you. That's a temptation of your heart. And maybe it's because you didn't have a father who treated you very well. He was absent, he was distant, he neglected you, he did not care for you, but that is not what verse 32 says about my God. Verse 32 says that God is a loving Father. Verse 32 tells me that it's God's good pleasure to give us what we need. Your God is attentive, and so trust him. If that's what's holding you back from seeking his kingdom first, you don't have to worry. He will never leave you or forsake you. He will provide what you need. And in closing, verse 34, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. This is the conclusion of our message, but would you bow your head and close your eyes? This is our invitation and my final point. Where is your heart this morning? Are you rich towards God or yourself? Are you seeking his kingdom or your own? It's not about the money. It's about something much deeper than that. Because how you spend your money is an indicator of what you truly love. And so this morning, in the silence between you and God, your heavenly Father, your loving Father, would you do an audit of your own heart? We'll take a moment of silence, and if you've been convicted, I think I do have that spirit of greed. I think I do have that spirit of anxiety. Would you confess that to our loving Father, repent of that, and seek his kingdom first? We'll take a moment of silence, and I'll close this in prayer.